My daughter has a story. This is just like one vignette, and it just illustrates it maybe from the Palestinian side. So she attended a Messianic service one night in Jerusalem, and she was traveling back into Bethlehem late at night through the checkpoint. And first of all, she had a hard time in the Messianic service because they were celebrating soldiers that some of the Israeli soldiers in their times of service, and so the militarism just was hard for Janae, to the kind of the glorification of that militarism, and she was on the other side and kind of felt the brunt of that. Mm-hmm. But she really wanted to try and reach out to the Messianic side. She just didn't want to hear the Palestinian Christian side, and she tried to take intentional steps to do that. But on her way through, back into Bethlehem, it didn't help because she was going through, and there was a Palestinian family that was being held up at the checkpoint, and they'd been there for, an hour or so. And Janae just struck up a conversation and said, why are you standing here? Why aren't you going through? And they said, well, the guard on the other side said that there isn't somebody to receive us on the other side. And she said, no, I came from there. No, there's somebody there. And so my daughter, my little, precious little 20-year-old daughter, went to advocate for these Palestinian family that was kind of stuck there. And so she went and she engaged one of these Israeli soldiers and said, why didn't you let him through? And the Israeli soldier kind of acted, first of all, like they didn't know English. Mm-hmm. And my daughter kept pushing and said, come on, I know you know English. And soon they did start to speak to her and said, my daughter just did her naive, humble, compassionate, said, what? These folks have had a long day. You have a long day. You have family. You just want to go home. They just want to go home. Why don't you just let them through? There are people on the other side. I just came from there. And the Israeli soldier, and this is just one vignette, but it illustrates the point. It said, Palestinians are not human. They're terrorists.
Yeah, that's scandalous.
So there's this generalization, this dehumanization, this demonization that is the human condition. Is just a problem.
We need to absolutely resist that completely. We know Scripture calls us to acknowledge the humanity of the lowliest.
Yes.
And it's absolutely necessary to keep looking at those those complexities on both sides.
On both sides.
I think that's on the side of Christians. I think often the concern is that. The mirror image, which is in the desire to stress the humanity of the Palestinians and their dignity, that the real complexity of the issue is also being set aside.
Yeah.
So, for example, one of the things that I was concerned about as I read some of the documents on the Christ at the Checkpoint conference that was very much pro Palestinian rights. I would characterize it that maybe you have a more nuanced viewpoint of that, and you're welcome to speak to it. But as I read the different aspects of it, I was almost in shock because wait a minute, am I correct in thinking that there's huge amounts of persecution of these very same Palestinian Christians on the part of Hezbollah, on the part of Hamas, and even on the part of many Palestinians inside the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? Because I remember reading about this thing. So I had to go into the internet and I put in persecution of Palestinian Christians.
Yeah.
And of course, hundreds of entries came immediately. One of them, an extremely compelling documentary by CNN, which cannot be accused, I think, in any way of being pro-Israel, where it documents, in a scandalous sort of way, the systematic persecution and elimination, almost, of every vestige of Christianity in Palestine, in these Palestinian territories. It documented, for example, one was this attack on a Christian church and the destruction of it, because of a situation that was, it's these Palestinian Christians were not given even the opportunity to explain what had taken place or to maybe even correct the mistake that was made. But, CNN clearly spoke about over and over again about the fact that, there isn't, we know this for a fact. So I just wanted to check because I didn't hear, it would have been so natural in a conference such as this one to discuss the fact that, Palestinian Christians, I think their greatest persecution is not on the part of that wall or on the part of those Israelis, but really on the part of the very Palestinians whose rights, we want to acknowledge, and we want to find reasons. I want to find reasons to have a more, and I think I do have a nuanced point of view, because I've tried to look at all these different issues and try to familiarize myself with them. But I keep confronting such things as that right now, the Palestinian Christian population is diminishing at an extraordinary rate. Churches are closing down. Palestinian Christians are fleeing to other parts of the Middle East. There's a systematic persecution of them. Hezbollah and Hamas, in their declared intention to have Sharia law be the main foundation of their future government, are also implicitly and sometimes very explicitly acknowledging that these Christians will be second-rate citizens at best and probably persecuted, and that we see that wherever in the Arab Spring, for example, freedom has taken place in all of these oppressed countries, that like in Egypt, for example, Christians have been persecuted, but particularly I think in Palestine, in that area, these Palestinian Christians, if they were free to speak, many of them would say, hey, the first persecutors of our kind are not the Israelis, but really our own Palestinian brothers. But I was surprised that that issue was not addressed. And to me, that sort of immediately makes me kind of say, wow, we're doing the same thing. We're oversimplifying on both sides. We accuse the other side of oversimplifying, but we are incurring in the same kind of, I don't know, maybe you can explain to me where I'm wrong in that interpretation, because I'd love for you to be able to express that.
There were a lot of people on the outside that were making judgments of the conference itself, and so you read blogs and stuff. What's interesting to me, though, is there was an aggressive attempt at inviting Messianic Jewish leaders to come and participate in the conference, both as speakers, as plenary speakers, as seminar presenters, as part of the panels and dialogue. And the people that I felt were most courageous and heroic that came to the conference were the Messianic leaders. And what's interesting to me is that some of the folks that didn't attend, their viewpoint on what happened and their judgment on what happened was very different than the Messianic delegation that was actually there. I actually have a letter here that was a response of the delegation of Messianic leaders that were there. And they give some nuances and they give some understanding, but basically, if you read it, is very favorable in terms of what they felt that it was very beneficial to be there and be a part of the conversation. So I feel like that the conference there were certain, they were very clear on what the aims of the conference were, and let me just list them for you. These were the aims that the conference organizers put out before the conference and during the conference as the aim, and it was to empower and encourage the Palestinian church, to expose the realities of injustices in Palestinian territories and create awareness of obstacles to reconciliation and peace, to create a platform for serious engagement with Christian Zionism and an open forum for ongoing dialogue between all positions within the evangelical theological spectrum, and one more, motivate participants to become advocates for the reconciliation work of the church in Palestine and Israel and its ramifications for Middle East and the world. So that's what they really set out. So you knew going in that the Palestinian Christian voice, the evangelical Palestinian Christian voice, would be one that would be more dominant or heard. Now, to me, I've heard a lot of criticism about that, of saying, well, that isn't fair and balanced. But I would just ask you, if there is a gathering of Messianic Jews in Israel, for example, is every gathering in one of those, does a typical Western evangelical Christian, when they talk about this issue, do they always hear a fair and balanced position of this? Are we really aware of the evangelical Palestinian Christian perspective? So I felt it was very natural and appropriate. I felt like they were very honest in saying, if you come to this conference, we're going to give you our perspective. And so I feel like we have to be careful of defining their reality and perspective and insisting in them to frame it a certain way. Yes, there was certainly reference to Islamic persecution and the muddying of the water and the whole thing with the Muslim and Christian relationships. One of the speakers, as a matter of fact, that wasn't able to come was from the largest evangelical church in the Middle East, which is, of course, is in Cairo, and it's Pastor Sammy Morris, and he's at I don't know if I can always say it right, but it's like Casa Deborah Church in Cairo. And it was interesting because they interviewed him on his take of the revolution in Egypt and what the Christian response is in Egypt, and particularly the evangelical Christian response in his church more specifically. And I felt like he gave a very nuanced, it was very interesting to hear his perspective. So some folks Christians in the West, they may want to force words in a pastor like Pastor Sammy Morris's mouth. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important that we hear from him.
So you're saying that there is no persecution of Christians in Egypt?
I'm not saying there's not persecution.
Because of after the Arab Spring revolt and so on.
No, I mean, so first of all, I'm not an authority on the situation in Egypt. But just if folks can go online and hear what he said. It's about a 20-25 minute kind of dialogue and interview where he's describing what was happening, what the position of their church was throughout this whole ordeal. And so basically he felt like that this was a movement that was calling for democracy and justice and freedom, and that as people of the kingdom and as the church, they could support those values. They did not take a political position as a church. There were different members of the church who, whether they would choose whether they would be involved in the demonstrations or whatnot. And so he really addresses the thing, and then the whole thing of the Islamic Brotherhood, or are they going to co-opt this process now? He really speaks to that. And so again, that's a whole other huge conversation of what does the Arab Spring mean, and what does it mean for Christians in that area of the world. But I personally think it'd be very important for us to listen to voices like Sammy Morris.
Absolutely.